Hey there, my name is Chris Bale. I'm a professor of Sociology and Public Policy at Duke University and the director of the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. And in this video, I want to talk to you about something you probably all care about, which is getting a job. All right, it's my pleasure to tell you today about kind of how to get a job in computational social science. So who am I? Why should you listen to me about this really important subject? Right? We all want jobs. We all want good jobs. Why should you listen to me? I have been a professor and a postdoc at 3 different institutions. I've been doing this for about 15 years. Probably more importantly, I've mentored dozens of students. Many of them have secured jobs in a range of different academic institutions. I've been on nearly a dozen hiring committees where we try to hire people in academia. And I've also often talked to other people who want to hire a computational social scientist. And so I'd like to think I have a pretty good idea of the pathways to getting a job in computational social science. Why you shouldn't listen to me. I am a professor. My experience in grad school was all about learning to become a professor. Right? That's what we do. We are not taught to train you how to get non-professor jobs. Right? It's just not what we do. I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of governments and companies. I have students that work in government and companies, former students. So I think I have more than maybe the next professor's level of knowledge about how to get other types of jobs outside of academia. But I just want to give a big sort of caveat up front that I'm going to be focusing a lot on sort of the academic job market, and I'm going to weave in insights about other job markets in industry and in nonprofits and in government. But unfortunately, I don't have the personal experience of getting those jobs. I also want to say that I am a white cisgendered male. I have many privileges, and my experience is also shaped by that background. I have tried to learn from students, colleagues, and others and become sensitive to these issues, but I'll almost certainly be leaving out some difficult challenges for people who don't have the privileges that I do. Okay. I want to also say I have a lot of I've tried for many years to learn about how to get a job from a range of different people. So in Duke Sociology, where I work, every year I teach a workshop about how to get a job. And one of the first things I did was realize that I only knew how to get a type of job like the one I have. And so what I did is I sort of surveyed, somewhat intentionally, people in a lot of different career sort of different types of careers, sort of learn what they had to do to get their job. So again, what I'm going to share with you today is sort of a combination of my own unique experience, but I am going to try to weave in some things I've learned from sort of trying to systematically study this process. And once again, I'm going to try to cover a lot of things that are specific to computational social science. So what are some of the unique opportunities and challenges that you may face trying to get a job as someone who specializes in computational social science? So the first thing I want to go over is just like what kind of jobs are out there for computational social scientists. There's some good news here. Many people go to graduate school, aspire to go on to be a professor, and our field is growing really rapidly. I've been sort of informally tracking the number of advertisements about jobs in computational social science. Not necessarily a field called computational social science, but jobs in an economics department with a focus on computational social science, or jobs in a political science department with a focus on sort of data science or computational social science. And I can say through this sort of informal study that the jobs just keep growing and growing every year. So that's great. But another thing that makes us really fortunate as computational social scientists is we have a lot of skills that are marketable outside of universities too. So at 6 you can learn about natural language processing, right? There's a ton of companies that are interested in hiring people with those skills. There's a ton of places interested in hiring people with skills with machine learning, right? Now, I think we can offer something even more, though, which is that we do have technical skills, right? But even more importantly, we have some understanding about how human beings fit into the analysis that we're doing, right? We actually have research skills. And it turns out our research skills are very marketable far outside of academia too, in ways that you might not expect. So really, I think the future is pretty rosy. It's you know, job markets are always difficult. You know, the joke I always tell from my own experience is I went on the academic job market immediately after the 2008 recession. So this probably feels like a million years ago to many of you, but just to recap, like the economy just totally plummeted. There was a housing crisis, there was a lending crisis, you know, similar to what happened with COVID. There were a ton of hiring freezes. You know, people that were hiring pulled those jobs, and it was dark. I mean, I was very, very fortunate. I had been very fortunate to be successful in graduate school, but you know, even I was worried, and many of my friends and colleagues were very worried too. And you know, I was complaining about this to a professor in my department in my graduate school who had been on the academic job market immediately after the 1978 OPEC crisis, when similarly, right, the economy plummeted and you know, inflation went through the roof and everybody stopped hiring, right? So I mentioned this anecdote to say, like, the job market is kind of always tough, and if you are the type of highly motivated person who not only got into a graduate school and is trying to do a PhD, but is willing to spend hours or weeks of your life learning in places like this about, you know, about how to do the work and how to get the job, right? You are a very highly motivated person, and you probably have very high expectations for yourself. And no matter what your field, you know, jobs can be difficult to get. You know, if we were a group of lawyers, elite lawyers, right, probably many people would be complaining about how hard it is to get a job. So the job market is tough. There are certainly some things about academic job markets that make them particularly tough, and we'll talk about that today. But I just want to place everything in context and just say, great jobs are hard to get, no matter where you are. You know, if you know, I would say the same thing. If your dream job is to be a civic integrity researcher at Google or Meta or something like that, that's a really, really hard job to get. If your dream job is to get a tenure track position at a liberal arts college in California, that's a really hard job to get too, right? These are all sort of hard career paths, and just like they are in so many other fields. Okay, so let's take a look at the types of jobs that are sort of out there for computational social scientists. I'll begin with the academic jobs. So we usually kind of informally categorize academic jobs into a few different categories. The first two are Research 1 and Research 2. A Research 1 university is a pretty elite kind of university. You could think of it roughly as sort of the top 50 universities in sort of university rankings, US News and World Report or whatever. And the reason we're called like Research 1 universities is that the emphasis in these places is to do research. Teaching is, of course, important everywhere, but the universities think of themselves first and foremost as producing research and hiring researchers who publish the very best research in the world. And therefore, the emphasis is on is usually more on research than teaching, and very often you will be allowed more time to do research than teaching. So, you know, you may teach 4 classes a year at an R1 job, but you may teach 8 classes a year at a liberal arts college, right? So there's a lot of variation here. And R2 is sort of like maybe in the 50 to 100 rankings, roughly speaking. And these are still very serious research institutions that want their faculty to be doing research and want them to be doing, you know, ideally world-class research, but failing that, you know, still very good research that's getting published. They care a lot about raising money and getting grants. And of course, though, they also care about teaching. And the reason we sort of have these distinctions is there's sort of different career paths to getting jobs at these places. So expectations to get a job at an R1 university are usually demonstrated excellence in research and maybe to a lesser extent teaching. The reason I say demonstrated excellence, so, you know, imagine you are an elite university. Like you are let's say, okay, we're in North Carolina, so let's talk about Duke and UNC, which are like, you know, two very elite universities around here. You know, and what you care about is moving up in the rankings from position number 15 to 12, right? or from 20 to 15, or maybe even from 30 to 2 if you're a super aspirational provost or president of a university, right? What you need to do is to hire the people who are going to produce the very best research in the world, right? And this is a tricky bet to make, right? What better evidence, what better bet to make than someone who has already demonstrated that they can do it, and ideally that they can do it on their own, or at least show strong potential to be able to continue to do it after you hire them, right? We would all love for the academic sort of caste system not to exist, right? We know there's a small number of universities that produce a lot of PhDs, and then they tend to hire those other PhDs, right? I'm not going to pretend that prestige doesn't matter, but it's also the case that prestige doesn't get you a job, right? You have to have some demonstrated, strong potential to continue, not only to have published in great places, but to continue doing it. People are making a bet on you. They could hire lots of different people. Why should they hire you? Well, they want to have some assurance that you are going to contribute to the mission of the university, which is to remain a prestigious producer of research. R2 is sort of similar thing. You still want to have really great publications. Maybe the expectations for where those things are published is a little less high. But a funny thing about R2s is that many of them are very aspirational. So if you are a university that's, let's say, ranked, rankings are all kind of BS, but like, let's say you're ranked 55, right? And if you could just move up 5 spots, you'd be in the top 50, and you'd sort of make that transition to R1. And a lot of people, leaders of universities, are trying to make that transition, right? You're going to work your faculty hard. You're going to want to hire. You might even push your faculty harder because you're saying, we need science papers, we need PNAS papers, we need Nature papers because we're aspirational, we want to move up, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that expectations across the board are less high. It really sort of depends on the place. The next sort of area in academia is sort of a liberal arts job or a primarily teaching job. And these are places where the primary focus of professors is to teach students, and a lot of emphasis is shown on your potential to be a great teacher. But I want to be really clear from the research I've done and students I've had who have wound up and sort of aspired to these jobs, is that research is still an expectation. So it's not as if you can only be a good teacher and get these jobs. These places, most of these places, still expect you to be producing research. Again, maybe the expectations are a lot lower. The quality of the journals might be lower, but they're still expecting you to do research. And in talking with a lot of professors and faculty at liberal arts schools, this is a real frustration, because they will say things to when I interviewed them for the research for this talk, like people think that I just teach, but really I teach and I do research, and it's that much harder to do research when I'm teaching 4 classes a semester or whatever it is, right? So research is still very much a part of the job, and juggling these things, no matter where you go in academia, is a difficult part of the job. The last and sort of toughest road, in my opinion, is to be a non-tenure track or adjunct professor, which is a temporary position that doesn't have any guarantee of future employment. These positions are often like embarrassingly poorly compensated. I say embarrassing because prestigious universities often operate on the hard labor of people who are in precarious employment positions, and I think that's just wrong. I don't have a solution for it, but I just want to flag it as an outcome. Now, some people sort of are able to move from an adjunct position to a more permanent position, but I think many people I've talked to in those positions would say that's a really tough path too, because as soon as you're an adjunct, you're trying to get that next job. You're not only trying to do research and teaching, but trying to find another job. And finding a job takes a lot of time, as we'll see when we get into the concrete parts of what goes into your job application. Okay, so that's academia in a nutshell. Let's turn to industry. So one of the things, as I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, that's sort of exciting is that computational social scientists are increasingly employed outside of academia. We have more job options than the next social scientist or the next computer scientist very often. And I did some analysis for this lecture, looking at sort of the number of people who have started working in the tech sector who have, say, social science PhDs. And that number has increased from about 4% to about 7%. So that's not a, we're still a tiny part of the tech industry, but a 4 to 7% increase is substantial over about 10 years. We've almost doubled. So that means that there's a lot more jobs than a lot of people realize. And frankly, universities haven't woken up to this reality. I'll say, especially in computational social science, a lot of the most exciting research is happening in industry. Why? Because, companies like Google or Twitter or Meta have data that, enables, analysis that many of us can't do if we're in academia. They're also producing techniques. You'll learn about a lot of them if you watch other videos in the 6 series, like, word embeddings came out of Google, right? A lot of parallel computing and cloud computing came out of industry. A lot of the tools that we need to analyze data at scale came out of industry. And so, there's a real important pipeline from academia to industry, not just for supplying labor in a workforce, which all the companies I just mentioned needed, but also for improving science. And I think a lot of professors, particularly older faculty, think of industry as sort of a bad outcome. And I think it's important that we sort of recognize that there's a lot of serious researchers, a lot of very talented researchers working in these places. And those people tend to have jobs. Sometimes they're called researchers or scientists. Sometimes they're called data scientists. That's a little less common because data science usually implies more, data analytics and analyzing the more technical part of things rather than doing research. A lot of social scientists work in sort of integrity roles. Those are sort of like your job is to help improve, the health of a platform or deal with sort of social science kind of problems inside a company. Many folks are also UX researchers. That means you're sort of working on the design of systems in tech companies. And I focused a lot on tech companies, but computational social scientists get hired in many different types of companies now. Why? Because there's so many different cases where there's massive amounts of data that describe human behavior that require insights from social science in order to analyze them. And again, you may be more marketable in these areas than you realize because the skills you have are not just, hey, I can run this NLP model in R, but also because you know how to do research. You might not realize it, but in writing a dissertation or a master's dissertation, you are learning a generalizable skill, which is to design, execute, and analyze and describe research. And that has a lot of value to people outside of academia. Now, it's going to be very, very different, right? You're not going to be dealing with the peer review system very often. People in industries occasionally do continue publishing, but more often, the research is much, 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 much less public, right? It's only being shared inside the corporation. Secondly, the time scale is profoundly different, right? In academia, we're sometimes spending 2, 3, maybe even more years on a single piece of research, right? In a corporate setting, you may design, execute, analyze, and write up a study in 3 days, and often in response to some kind of unforeseen or emergent development in the world. And so it's just profoundly different. You need to be ready to do the research yesterday. And we are not trained to do that, right? We're trained to carefully and meticulously go through this process where we critique each other and reflect and revise and resubmit, right? And this is just profoundly different if that's where you've been trained. So one of the keys to succeeding in these places, as we'll see when we go into like the job search process and the interview process, is sort of learning how to demonstrate that you can also do research in a very applied way and in a very rapid way. Okay. The next sort of set of jobs are in nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits or think tanks are very interested in computational social science. Some of them may have a dedicated mission in the area. We'll see in a future 6 video about kind of getting grants and who's active in this area. But there are a lot of nonprofits that do research, right? Maybe they're think tanks that sort of try to translate academic research into policy. Maybe they do research for research's sake, just outside of academia. Maybe they do federally funded research outside academia. There's a lot of different places that researchers can wind up inside nonprofits. Again, they may be called researchers, analysts, or data scientists. And again, like industry, the expectations are quite different. Peer-reviewed publishing is much rarer. You might do a lot more public writing. You might be writing reports. You might still be doing a lot of things you would do in academia, like writing grants, but you are still sort of writing for a very different audience. And just like in industry, there might be real problems in the world that you need to work on right away. If you're working for a think tank that is active in international relations, and all of a sudden Russia invades Ukraine, and you were, erstwhile working on, narcotics in Colombia or something like that, or the U.S., right? All of a sudden, you gotta get up to speed on something that you don't know much about, right? So it's a very different learning and research environment, and you can imagine the trade-offs right away, right? You're taught to meticulously prepare and design and execute research in these very formal ways that are simply not possible in a lot of these settings. And you also don't get the same level of criticism and scrutiny if you don't go through blind peer review like we do so often inside academia. So it's just fundamentally different. The last big area that I've seen computational social science scientists get a lot of jobs is in governments. Increasingly, governments are overwhelmed by data, like so many other corporations and just like academia, right? And there are sort of new data sets that enable new kinds of analysis. I mean, everything from more granular data about crime to more granular data about vaccination to both of those examples, right, are fundamentally about social science, right? If you are analyzing data about crime and you don't have the wherewithal to know about response bias and the generation of crime reporting, like say a lot of people who are trained in just data science or just computer science might approach the data set and just say, okay, well, here's where the crime is happening, right? And not be sensitive to things like, well, police might be going to this area more than another area, or people in this area might not report crime, or these kinds of things that a social scientist who has training in this area will know to ask. So you'll see people in sort of researcher and data science or analyst roles in government as well. And once again, just like in industry and in nonprofits, the expectation is that you can use your research and analysis skills to do very applied things, right? To translate the research into actionable stuff. And that's something that really unites everything outside of academia, and something that's really important for you to know if you don't want to go into academia, is that your research has to have a purpose, right? We have the luxury in academia of studying science for science's sake, right? I don't know what the equivalent of fruit flies are in computational social science. Maybe it's like Reddit or something, something that's very easy to study and that we can all kind of tinker with to kind of explore insights, even if they might be sort of not the most pressing problem in the world. Maybe that's a bad example because a lot of important stuff happens on Reddit, but maybe you get the direction I'm going. We can do science for science's sake. All of these other areas do not do science for science's sake, right? In industry, you are doing research to help a company be more profitable almost all the time. In nonprofits, you are doing research to help the nonprofit accomplish its mission, whether its mission is improve the well-being of inner city youth or reduce the spread of misinformation in Western Europe, right? Whatever it is, you have a mission. Same with government, right? We want to reduce crime. We want to improve vaccination, right? Now, many of those things happen in academia too, and a lot of research we do in academia, in my opinion, some of the best research does all these things. But the main difference we're seeing here is that the research actually has to have a real applied outcome. Now, that doesn't mean that your own research or dissertation has to have some immediate upshot for the field you want to go into. Again, you are getting hired because you have skills as a researcher, not all the time because of what your dissertation was about, right? But it does mean that you have to be able to think outside of academia. And in academia, right, it's pounded into you, this is how you push an article, this is how you get a professor job, this, right? But how you solve a problem in the world on short order with other people, with less information than you want, with huge consequences for lots of people, is not something we are taught to do, right? So in a lot of the steps towards getting these types of jobs, is learning how to talk about research in ways that are actionable. A lot of times when we publish peer review articles, we have the luxury of not talking about the implications or broader impacts of our research at all, right? It's just science for science. We just want to know, right? We don't know how to fix, inequality. We don't know how to fix political polarization, but we sure can tell you a lot of what we think about it, right? Very, very different outside of academia, right? We want solutions, or if you're inside industry, right? You may have a really good idea that you think may improve civility on, let's say, a social media platform, but if that's gonna not serve a business purpose, or even worse, if it's going to, harm a business purpose and maybe make the company less profitable, you're gonna have a hard time getting people to sponsor that research and especially implement insights from that research. That's not to say that people in industry are somehow unethical or less, serious scholars. It's just to underscore the reality that the way resources are distributed is to, make money for shareholders. So it's just a very different landscape that you're going to navigate in corporate settings. You'll see maybe less of that in nonprofit or government settings, but in government, you may be asked to do research that is sort of not in line with what you'd like to be doing, or where your politics are and things like that. And so one of the chief differences, I talked a lot about what's good about being outside of academia, but I think the single thing that probably I think most computational social scientists who stay in academia value is the power to be self-directed and the power to control what you're researching every day. And I think people who wind up in industry or seek jobs in industry and nonprofits and governments will tell you that is something you almost always give up in these settings. Not in every single situation. There are examples of people who are pretty self-directed in places like Microsoft Research, but that is usually the exception to the rule. I mention all this to make the simple point that the grass is always greener on the other side. If your experience is like mine in graduate school, any type of academic path may seem like the worst possible outcome possible, right? Like you failed and it's terrible, right? But then maybe you talk to someone who actually left academia and they're like, it's great. I don't have to deal with, blind review. I don't have to get grants. I didn't really like teaching. I'm making more money, right? There's many reasons why the grass is always greener. And I think the most important thing you can do as you're sort of exploring your career options is, once again, don't do it alone. Talk to people. Talk to people who you want to be like. If you want to be a professor, go talk to an assistant professor. If you want to be a postdoc, go talk to a postdoc. If you want to be a civic integrity researcher at Meta, go talk to a civic integrity researcher at Meta. We have a massive network in SIX. You can go to the people page and search our database and see that people are all over the place and very often willing to have an informal conversation about, say, how to get a job in a place like Meta or wherever, or the Bureau of Justice or the Department of Justice, wherever you might want to work. But as you're doing this, keep in mind that people's experiences just can be really idiosyncratic, right? If you just used Twitter to inform your job search, this would be a terrible mistake, right? You would hear that academia is the worst possible outcome one could ever wind up in, right? You would hear that it's terrible and nobody likes their life and everybody works too much. And right, you'd hear nothing about the far more common story that I frankly hear. I mean, I'm, again, very privileged person at a very wealthy university, but even my friends who are at less prestigious universities will tell you, I love being a professor. It's like, it's an amazing job. And you don't hear that message on Twitter, right? In fact, people who try to say that on Twitter often get attacked for being insensitive to the experience of others, and that's important. We should call people out on being insensitive and stuff like that, but we also need to get that good message out. There are wonderful things about academia that you can't do in any other setting, I believe, and it's still, I think, one of the best possible careers you can wind up with. That said, I see a lot of value, as I was just saying, and I want universities and professors and people in computational social science more broadly to accept the reality that much of the best research is happening outside of academia, and that much of the most important and actionable research is happening outside of academia, and much of the research that's going to be the most impactful is happening outside of academia. And the problem, of course, is that we don't have the training system set up to try to funnel people into these alternative career pathways. They're really not even alternative anymore, given the number of people who are graduating from PhD programs and actually getting tenure track jobs. It's actually probably slowly becoming a plurality or a majority of people who are going into non-academic settings. And we have been slow to respond. So lectures like this are like my small way to start chipping away at that and try to sort of illuminate these different pathways. Again, though, I'm a professor. I don't have all the details that I would like to have to sort of guide you on this path. I can, though, guide you through the academic path with meticulous and maybe even painful amounts of detail. And I'm going to do this same sort of timeline for industry, government, and nonprofit jobs, too. But let's begin with academic positions. So you might be wondering, when should I start thinking about a job, or when should I start applying for jobs? A lot of people who come through sixth are in their like third, fourth, fifth year of graduate school. A lot of people are postdocs who may be looking for jobs. A lot of people are junior faculty who may be looking to move jobs. And the number one thing I recommend is to start thinking about, no matter whether you're going to academia, industry, nonprofits, or wherever, is start thinking about your job process early. Don't think of it in the first year of graduate school. That's your one time to actually freely explore. And that's like a precious time. It's also a stressful time and an overwhelming time, but it's precious. You're actually getting to explore what's out there and research, and it's even exciting. But if we think about the median time it takes to publish and the inevitability of multiple rejections, and if we think that each rejection is going to take, let's say, 6 months by the time we submit it, and if we're lucky enough, it gets reviewed and we get feedback, and then we revise and then resubmit to another journal as a new submission, right? And we have to do that 4, 5, 6 times to get that first attempt at research done. It means that you really need to start thinking about your graduation, say 5, 6, 7 years after you've started a PhD, in your second and third and fourth year. It doesn't mean that you have to firmly pick your path and say, I'm going to go to this type of R1 job in this place, right? Nobody can do that, right? We should all be so lucky. But it does mean that you're going to have to start beginning to think about what you're going to prioritize. We're looking here at the timeline for academic positions in the final year of a PhD. So what we're seeing here is that much of the action happens in the fall before you would defend your dissertation in the spring. So most applications for academic jobs are due in the late summer or early fall. There's some variation by fields here. Some go a little later. And before you can make that application, we're about to go through what goes into a file to get a job. But it's pretty involved. There are statements you have to write. There's writing samples and things like that. And that means that you want to still be getting everything under review, but you want to be mindful that there's a lot of work that's going to go into actually making the job file itself. That's something that I encourage people to start this spring before their final year, with an eye towards getting all their applications in, ideally at the end of summer. Then you'd have sort of conferences like here, the American Sociological Association, but if you're in political science, that might be APSA, or whatever your discipline is. And then, then we're starting to see how, the process unfolds from the other side. So you've been doing a lot of work. Lots of candidates all over the world are doing work, and they're submitting files. Now let's start to take the perspective of the people doing the hiring. This is going to be foreign to you until you're on the other side, and until you've been in like a dozen search committees like I have, and until you've gone through the hard work of hiring someone, tenuring, seeing someone through the tenure process, and so much else. Again, this process is totally opaque, frustratingly so. Right? We see almost none of it as graduate students. We sort of hear, like through the rumor mill, or even worse, through Twitter or other social media, like how the job market goes, right? But the reality is that most of it is opaque because for a lot of different reasons. There can be everything from like legal reasons that people are worried about publicizing, decisions about how people hired could be legally actionable, and that can make people sort of less willing to talk, to to people just not wanting to put their foot in their mouth by saying that someone's going to get hired when maybe their colleagues disagree. There's a veil of privacy that's sort of necessary for people to make decisions. It's not just because they want to be sort of mean and like, there's a power differential here. I'm not going to pretend there's not, right? The people doing the hiring have all of the power. But let's take their position for a minute here. Let's say, it's not as if we just magically get the opportunity to hire. It's not like, I'm sitting in a faculty meeting and it's like, oh, we have to hire this year. Great. Like, let's go hire someone. Let's all just, we're going to get a bunch of applications and then we'll pick someone, right? That is not at all how it works. I'm in a faculty meeting and I say, I think we really need to hire this type of person, right? And then maybe one of my colleagues says, yeah, that's a great idea, or someone else says, that's a terrible idea, I want to hire this other kind of person, right? We maybe have 5, 6, 7 of those meetings, and eventually we've maybe decided that we need to hire in one of these 3 areas. Then we, or our chair, has to go talk to the university and say, we need to hire someone in these 3 areas. And they say, well, guess what? The computer science department hasn't hired anybody in 4 years, and you guys just hired 3 people in the last 5 years. You're not making a strong enough case to hire this person. So we have to do a lot of work to, conversations. Sometimes we even have to write reports and proposals to hire someone. And these are detailed things that can require analysis of job markets and patterns of retirements and things like that. So even getting to the point where we have permission to try to hire someone, a lot of work is going into that. Next, we have to staff that committee. That means at least 3 people, sometimes more people, are going to, again, volunteer their time because they're not getting, any kind of credit for being on a job search committee, just like you don't get any credit for being the editor of a journal, right? To, very carefully review what can often be a really large number of applications, right? And, and again, that takes time, right? And then let's say that committee then whittles down this list to 6 people. And then the faculty again has a meeting and then another meeting. And then even before we can invite those people for an interview, we have to write another report to the university often saying why we think these are the best people to hire, describing our process, how it's been objective, why it's satisfying the need that we said we had, right? And then, even then, we can get rejected in the university. This is rare, but the university might say, no, sorry, you didn't make a strong enough case, right? So by the time the people have actually come to give a job talk, a ton of work has happened by a ton of people. And that's just the beginning, because then everybody goes to all the job talks, everybody meets with all the candidates, and then in order to make an offer, once again, you can probably guess by now, we have to write another report or a proposal to the university. Here's why we're hiring this person. Here's what their qualifications were. Here's a summary of the faculty meeting, and so on and so forth, right? So tremendous amount of work goes into hiring on the faculty and university side. I didn't say anything about all the administrators inside the university who have to review HR policies and cross T's and dot I's and all sorts of other stuff to make this happen, but a ton of people are doing a lot of work, right? And now, unlike, let's say, a corporation where there might be a budget to hire people often, imagine that your department only has the opportunity to hire someone once every 5 years. And it might be even less than that if you're in a liberal arts school where there's a really small faculty because more people are teaching and so they sort of need less people or the school is smaller in general. And then, this is your one opportunity to hire, right? Maybe in 4 or 5 years, right? And not only that, this person, you could be stuck with this person for life, right? And that's the goal, right? You want to be stuck with this person, but you want to not only hire them, you want them to get tenure, but that also means that you are hiring someone who's going to be with you for the rest of your career. Think about that for a minute. Like any other job, right? If someone acts out, if they turn out to be a jerk, or if they wildly blow up in some weird way, they get fired, right? They probably should get fired, right? And to be honest, I think there's a lot. This is probably a contrarian view, but I think a lot of professors do awful things with tenure, and they can be uncivil, they can be mean, they can even be unethical, and all sorts of other bad things, but they can't be fired, right? So this is a huge decision for a department. It feels like a huge decision for you too. You've suffered through months of preparing a file. You've gone through interviews where you've been told nothing if you're lucky enough to go over interviews. You have no information. The asymmetry here and the power differential is extreme, right? And you just want to know, did you get the job? Did you get the job? But remember, on the other side, there are people whose lives are going to be affected for maybe decades, right? So it's a big decision. And unfortunately, you are going to be in the dark and you have no idea what's going on. You might get little bits of information from colleagues or advisors or mentors, and maybe you can get little bits of information. But the fact is, you need to do this. You need to let this huge group of people who have been working really hard for a really long time make their own decision, and that's just rough. It's rough because that doesn't happen in other fields, right? There's a lot more transparency. You see what they want, why they're hiring people. You maybe can look at things like Glassdoor and see things like maybe who ultimately, or LinkedIn, and see who ultimately got the job, and there's some transfer. There's very little of that in academia. So it's just a really frustrating, opaque process, and one that I'm trying to, again, pull back the curtain on a little bit. And a theme here is take the perspective of the people doing the hiring, right? They're not just mean and want to exert power over a group of people who are sort of feel at the whim of a sometimes mercurial job market. They have real needs and goals, and they've put in a lot of effort. Okay, so you've gone through interviews. Maybe you're lucky enough to get a job offer, then you still have to finish your dissertation, and then you would assume that faculty position in the fall. Postdocs, similar kind of thing. There's a file that you prepare. Often there's interviews, and you'd get an offer probably going into the spring to start in the fall. The postdocs often have a more fluid sort of timeline. Okay, so this job file that I said you should spend a lot of time working on, what does it include? It includes a cover letter that explains who you are, what type of research you do, where you've been, where you're going. It maybe explains and tailors your desire to join this place that you're trying to join because of reasons X, Y, and Z. This is your opportunity to sort of showcase any important information too. If you have, there's some difficult decisions that can be made here. But if you are, let's say you are from Amherst, Massachusetts, and you're applying to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, this is the space where you might mention that kind of thing. That's not going to get you the job, right, at all, right? Because remember, this is this group of people. They want to hire the person that they think is best. They probably don't care that you're from Amherst. But if it comes down to you and another person, and they're concerned that other person is maybe not interested in moving to Western Massachusetts, then maybe at the margins that matter. So it's sort of an opportunity to communicate some informal stuff, maybe something that doesn't show through on your CV, your research statement, and these other documents that I'm about to describe. Your CV is probably the single most important thing. I would never say that academia is a meritocracy where we sort of all succeed based on the merit of our work, but it is probably more meritocratic than you realize. I would say on average, having been on hiring committees in multiple universities, you'd be surprised. People actually do read stuff, and they actually do evaluate people based on the quality of the work. But they're also very busy. Remember, these are people who are, again, volunteering their time to serve on a hiring committee. They're seeing often maybe as many as hundreds of applicants. They don't have time to read everything, right? So the single most important document, might even get read before the cover letter, is the CV. And this is the thing that is most in your control as a young computational social scientist. You can't control whether the economics department at your dream school is hiring. You can't control whether your research on gender is what the search committee of the political science department at Brigham Young University wanted to sort of wanted someone to cover, right? All you can control is what's on your CV. And again, this is an opportunity to sort of detach yourself from your career, your research, make that metamorphosis from the person and who's inextricably linked to the research, right? This is the thing that's in your control. You can actually produce another publication. You can produce another line on your CV. This is the single most important thing, and the good news is it's the thing that's most in your control. After the CV, there are statements that describe your research and teaching. These usually range between 4 to 8 pages, and they go into a lot of detail, sort of explaining what your research is, why it's important, what the contribution is, how it fits into the bigger picture of your discipline, or maybe computational social science if it was a position tailored to computational social science. And then importantly, it says where you're going. Remember, this university, this group of people, this department is betting on you to continue doing what you're doing. You better have a good plan, a convincing plan for what you're going to continue to do. Because if it just looks like you did a really interesting study in graduate school, but it was co-authored with 3 other people, how can we be sure that this person is going to continue to produce really high quality, interesting, and publishable work on their own, right? A detailed plan is a great way to demonstrate that you can do that. It needs to be feasible. It needs to be seem shovel ready, right? It needs to seem like it can be done and that you are the person to do it, but you need to have a plan. Then you'll also have evidence of teaching excellence. I almost said accidents. That sounds terrible. Hopefully you won't have any teaching accidents. But basically, this can be a statement about your teaching philosophy, a description of how you've evolved as a teacher, evidence from course evaluations that you may have taught or TA'd in graduate school that show what kind of teacher you are or could become. Writing samples, so if you've sort of made an initial cut of people looking at your CV and it's like, oh, this person seems like a maybe, right? There might be an initial screening. Some departments will even separate people based on really crude things, like if they have no publications, right? An R1 might say, we're not even gonna look at this person, right? Or if they don't have a PhD in the right field, they might get cut out, right? That's a very crude kind of initial pass. Then there's usually a sort of a rough pass of like, this is stuff we're gonna read closely, this is stuff we're gonna skim, right? So this is where writing samples become really important and research statements become, when you've made that sort of initial cut, then they're actually reading your stuff, and then they're asking the question like, is this good research? Which is a very subjective and difficult to answer thing, right? But it's why, again, I encourage you to think about your job search early on, right? The reason is because you need to start producing these writing samples your first, second, third year in graduate school, ideally, or at least your second and third, maybe not your first year. Again, that's the fun time. That's the exploration time. But it's now passed you by because you're all here. So, and if you're here, you're probably past the year one of graduate school. So bad news. Okay, so we're gonna keep going. I'm gonna briefly just mention that one thing that employers think about, academic employers think about when they try to hire you, is sort of are you going to get tenure? Because remember, they had to make this case about why they should hire you. That took a lot of work. Then they had to do all this work to review all these applications. Then they had write these reports to hire you. And they may not even have the chance to hire again. They want you to get tenure. And so often the criterion that's being used as people are reviewing files is this person going to be able to get tenure here? And tenure, again, is a very involved process, right? We have committees and reviews and reports and dossiers and communications with deans and serving on appointment, promotion, and tenure committees, and people all around your discipline have to write, again, long anonymous letters after reading all of your work, again, an entirely volunteer activity. Then your entire department, or sometimes the tenure committee in your department, have to write another maybe 30 to 40 page single-space report that describes your research, that describes meticulously all these letters, and so much more. And even then, right, there's still this uncertainty that a university committee has to review it, and only then do you get tenure. So, what I'm trying to do is, again, peel back the curtain just so you can see how much work is going into and understand that the worst scenario is that people do all this work and then they hire someone who then doesn't get tenure and they have to do it all over again. Hiring is exciting for a department. We like to grow. We like to hire new people, but it's also a lot of work. Okay. So another sort of theme as I wrap up this segment of this talk is sort of you'll see this throughout an academic career and really whatever career you pursue, is to continuously sort of write your autobiography. So when you wrote your essay to get into graduate school, right? If you're like me, if you read it, you'd probably be laughing at yourself, like, "Oh God, that was cheesy," or why did I talk about that, right? But at the end of graduate school, you're going to write this job file, right? And that's almost like you're telling the story of yourself as a researcher. When you go up for your third year review as a professor, you're going to tell another story. It's going to be an evolution of that story. When you go up for tenure, you're going to tell another story. When you go up for full professor, you're going to tell another story, right? We are constantly writing about ourselves in this weird way, and it feels very formulaic and sort of almost unnecessary sometimes. It's like, do I really have to go through all this? And what I've realized, having now advanced through, the academic ranks, is we do this for a reason. It's because knowing where you come from helps you figure out where you're going. And we don't always, it's not a linear path, right? We don't know that I don't know that I was, that I was going to start, studying political polarization after writing about, anti-Muslim movements. That wasn't a linear path, right? In my various statements that I wrote over the years, I took weird U-turns and stuff. But now as I look back on my career and sometimes read through these documents, I'm like, there's actually like an evolving story there, you know, and it actually, in retrospect, can kind of help to write sort of short autobiographies about yourself, even at the level of like starting to figure out what your dissertation is about. Because again, even if it's not ultimately what happens, it illuminates possible paths, and that's really important in trying to get academic jobs. Okay, briefly, I'm going to go over the process for getting a job outside of academia, as I promised to do. I'm going to sort of hit on some highlights. The first is, like in academia, you absolutely need to start this process sooner than you think. Most computational social scientists who get jobs outside of academia, according to my research, are getting them through personal networks and ties. A very common path if you're in a company is to do an internship over the summer, paid or unpaid. Other people reach out through so-called informational interviews to alumni or other contacts to not necessarily to ask for a job, but to learn what it takes to get a job, that then puts the word out there that you're looking for a job, and then makes you maybe aware of other possible paths. During this process, you know, the hiring process outside of academia is not so formulaic. It doesn't all happen in the fall, and it doesn't all happen on the same. Government can have some parallels in terms of when budgets go through and things like federal budgets, and that can determine hiring cycles. But by and large, the hiring is much, much less formulaic and can happen on a rolling basis. It can happen when people leave or migrate. You know, people leave positions outside of academia much more fluidly, and so you know, there can be a lot more turnover. The second thing I would say is the interview process is going to be much different, right? The emphasis is going to be a lot. It's not about whether you're going to get tenure and whether you're going to continue to produce your own research independently. It's whether your skills can translate into the needs of the organization, the government agency, the company, the nonprofit. What is its mission? How does what you know how to do help them get there? You need to be able to communicate that in an interview in a way that's very, very different than, say, an academic context where you're giving a job talk about your research. They might not even care much about your research. They might just want to know that you have the skills and the wherewithal to design, execute, analyze, and communicate the findings of a study, right? And it might even be an advantage to, in these interviews, say that, you know, you're interested in learning something new, or, you know, that you're not just motivated by research. Communicate your seriousness about joining their organization, because a lot of people might worry that someone who looks very, you know, lined up for an academic career not only doesn't maybe have the bona fides of someone who winds up in the type of organization that they have, or at least the demonstrated accomplishments of, say, more public writing or more applied code or building actual things in the world, right? That they may look like they're just sort of here for a quick, you know, sojourn in industry and go back to academia, which is, by the way, exceptionally hard to do. A lot of people want to keep all their options open, and as you can see now, because there's so many decisions that you make in your third, fourth, fifth year of graduate school, doors eventually start to close when you realize that it's really hard to work an 80-hour-a-week internship and write a dissertation that's going to get published in a top journal, right? So you make decisions along the way, or maybe you're deciding to teach more, teach your own class for the first time because you've decided that a job at a liberal arts school is for you, right? Same thing though with industry, right? You have to sort of communicate your value added and communicate that you understand that the goals of the institution that you're joining, or organization you're joining, are different, and understand that you know how things work outside of academia. What better way to do that than to spend time outside of academia before you leave academia, giving you not only like a broader sense of what research looks like outside these settings, but also familiarity with, you know, the vernacular and the style of management and all the other things that, you know, one has to navigate when you're not your own boss or your own, you know, self-directed researcher like you are inside academia. And again, I think probably writing your autobiography could be useful to that end in sort of firming up where you've been and where you're going. There are many different pathways to a successful career in computational social science. Again, this has been sort of a brief overview of some of them. The very best thing you can do is talk to people and get that hands-on experience, but I hope this lecture today has helped you sort of pull back the curtain on the hiring process a little bit and understand sort of various pathways to career success in computational social science. Thank you. Thanks for joining me in this video about how to get a job in computational social science. And I want to leave you with a few quick takeaways. The first is there are so many exciting jobs out there.
You know, we tend to prioritize those that are in academia, but increasingly we're seeing large numbers of people go outside academia, and some of the most exciting research happen outside of academia too. So I hope that this video has taught you a little bit about how to pursue careers in different pathways and helped you see a little bit more about the trade-offs of going different routes. And I look forward to seeing you in future videos.